Hello and welcome back to Grisly History. I'm your host, Graham Parker.
I'm Michael Ruiz, producer of Grisly History.
And we are coming to you with a little bit of a different episode this time. When we set out to do the story of Franklin's last expedition, we knew up front that there are still quite a few unknowns. And I thought that rather than just describing those unknowns, it would be better to just sit down and have a conversation to look at the artifacts that we have and to talk about the theories that Franklin experts are still very much debating to this day. So this episode, Michael and I are going to lay out some of the biggest finds from the expedition and talk about the theories behind them. But with that said, I do want to briefly review the bare facts of the expedition, including its goals, its members, and the equipment that they had, because I think it lays a groundwork for the clues and maybe some red herrings along the way. So I'm not going to go into a detailed rehash of what happened, but let's just go over the expedition, the ships involved, and the crew itself. As we heard in the last episode, the expedition was the last authorized by Sir John Barrow in quest of the mythical Northwest Passage. So throughout his 40-year career, numerous attempts have been made to find the passage, which, again, the goal was to connect the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean through Canada's Arctic archipelago. Ostensibly to find a faster route to the Orient, but, also just to bring national prestige to Britain. By 1845, all but a few hundred miles of Canada's northern coast had been mapped, but much of the northern part of the Arctic archipelago still remained unknown. And Barrow and his contemporaries at the time believed that there was an open polar sea in the far north, which never froze because of hypothetical warm water currents flowing up from the south.
And just as an aside for what Graham was saying there about the open polar sea, I know this idea seems absolutely ridiculous in today's standards, but given the information that they had at the time, it kind of made a lot of sense to assume that if the equator at the time when they discovered it was clear and still inhabitable, that the polar ice caps or the polar caps would still be.
Right, there still wasn't like a ton of hard science, maybe informing a lot of the theories at the time. So thinking about it in terms of how they thought about the world, one could see how they would make that connection. But if that were true, then a ship could sail unimpeded once it made it through some of the ice in the south. And so by 1845, this expedition, which John Barrow was authorizing, had a primary and secondary navigation plan. The primary plan was to sail into Lancaster Sound, that body of water that bisects the southern and northern parts of the archipelago. So a ship was going to sail in there and head north into that hypothetical open polar sea. However, if ice conditions proved to be impossible, then they would instead turn south to Canada's northern coast, finish mapping it, and simply sail west into the Pacific. So with that in mind, the ships chosen for this expedition were the HMS's Erebus and Terror, both of which had participated in Arctic and Antarctic voyages. These ships were converted Hecla-class bomb ships. They were built for recoil. They had these heavy guns, and when these heavy guns fired, the ship would obviously shake, but they had all this ordnance on board which they didn't want to detonate. So hypothetically, if you were to bounce up against some ice, then, it would keep the ship intact.
So essentially, these ships would kind of absorb that energy when bounced upon them, and they wouldn't kind of rip apart. They'd be able to kind of shake or bend, kind of in a way that modern skyscrapers are able to withstand heavy windstorms.
Yeah, exactly. And the ships actually had a bit of history. For instance, the Terror saw combat during the War of 1812, or as the rest of the world knows it, the Anglo-American War. It participated in the bombardment of Fort McHenry in 1813, which was the event that inspired Francis Scott Key to pen the poem from which the lyrics to the Star-Spangled Banner come from.
It's kind of interesting to think about how lyrics like the bombs bursting in air came from the very ship that was involved in Franklin's lost expedition.
That's the interesting thing about history, is seeing how one event or one thing from history connects to another. Again, Captain Franklin was involved in some of the most decisive naval battles of the Napoleonic Wars, and, he went on to have this career exploring the Arctic.
I think we tend to look at these things as isolated incidents, specifically in the way that they are taught in our classrooms, because everything is broken down into specific units or to kind of tell a specific narrative. So when we're having conversations about things like the War of 1812 here in America, it's just kind of a good guy, bad guy kind of approach. So it's really interesting to think about how the other side of it, the villains in your history books, were actually just kind of doing other things that would later on become important historical events.
Yeah, it reminds me of something from, I mean, oddly enough, the movie The Social Network. There's a point where Eduardo talks about fashion, the idea that fashion is never finished, and it's the same thing with history. History just continues to flow, but we parcel it out, kind of like what you're talking about in terms of education. So when it came time for the expedition, these ships were modified to be even more sturdy than they were. This was done with the introduction of iron plating, starting from the bow to 20 feet back. And additionally, they had their hulls cross-planked to redistribute the impact forces from any ice that they might encounter. Picture in your head like a wooden ship and look at its hull, You've got all these planks curved and heading backwards. But if it's cross-planked, ice hits it, that force, instead of hitting that one side of the ship, it's kind of going across the ship. So the frame itself remains more stable than it would otherwise.
It's kind of interesting to think about because when I picture the Lost Expedition, I typically picture older wooden ships because in my mind, this is taking place before the 1900s. But you can kind of see this point in the construction of ships where you're going from these classical wooden vessels that you see in your history books to things that you might be more familiar with, like the Titanic. Like we're kind of seeing things that are a little more of like a hybrid approach to like ship construction.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, by 1845, I think something like 25% of the British Navy were steamships at this point. This was like rapid change in the way that they were doing shipping.
Yeah, so essentially these ships, like while retrofitted, this is cutting edge technology for 1945. This is the best that the United Kingdom can put together in order to like trudge through the ice up in the northern Canadian Archipelago.
And speaking of that, additional modifications to both of these ships involved the retrofitting of screw propellers as well as locomotive steam engines. These steam engines, which were 25 horsepower for the Erebus, which was the flagship, and 20 for the Terror, basically would allow the ships to break a little bit of ice while the ocean was freezing or as it was thawing. So, the idea wasn't that they would sail through the winter crushing ice. They actually only had 12 days worth of coal. But the idea is during the freeze up or during the thaw, they could make it a little bit farther than they would have been otherwise. And steaming did more than just break up the ice. The ship actually had a kind of state-of-the-art piping system at the time, which allowed them to pipe hot water all around the ship, providing some much-needed heating for the winter months. On top of this, the ships had a water filtration system that would allow them to convert salt water to fresh water, ensuring that they would never go thirsty. And as for food, the expedition was supplied with enough provisions to last them 3 years, or possibly as many as 5 on reduced rations. This was achieved in large part from the fairly recent miracle of canned foods. The expedition ordered 8,000 cans of soups, meats, vegetables, and others to supplement the regular supply of fresh food. And those 8,000 cans would go to feeding a crew of 134 men, again between 2 ships. These crews were made up of 24 officers and 110 regular seamen. Each ship would have 2 surgeons, 7 Royal Marines, and an ice master whose job was to interpret the various forms of ice that a ship would encounter. And just a brief aside on that, I think there was a contemporary book at the time that identified either 47 or 49 different types of sea ice. Because again, you have to imagine these guys, they're going up to the Arctic, you get frozen in for 2 years at a time. There's not much else to do, so you're going to look at the different ice. And so obviously somebody with experience looking at that ice would be needed to figure out, okay, what is going to be ahead of us on this next part of the journey? Hence an ice master. And I didn't mention this in the last episode, but there were a few non-human crew members as well. Namely, there was an unnamed cat whose job was to hunt down and kill stowaway mice on board. There was a Newfoundland dog named Neptune, and a little monkey that the crew named Jacko and made a tiny little pair of trousers for. Last 2, I think, came courtesy of Lady Jane Franklin.
I can't imagine the specific survivalistic use of a monkey with a tiny pair of trousers.
Well, in one of the last letters sent back by the crew, they said that Jacko actually really liked to steal things from the crew, like little bits of food and trinkets, but the crew just found it adorable. So as I mentioned in the previous episode, the Admiralty had some difficulty in deciding who should lead the expedition. Their first choice was the famed Antarctic explorer Sir James Clark Ross, who, had not only been part of his uncle's expedition, his 4-year-long expedition in the Arctic, but also led his own multi-year expedition in the Antarctic, and actually had used the Erebus and the Terror as part of that. So the Admiralty approached him, but he informed them that he had promised his wife that he was finished with Arctic exploration, and he had no intention of breaking his vow. Frustrated, they then went to considering the dashing and daring James Fitzjames. He was pretty interesting in his own right. He had expeditions to, I think, the Euphrates, and had been part of the Opium Wars. He did a lot of really cool stuff and probably would have had a great career. But the Admiralty deemed that he was too young and inexperienced to lead his own expedition. So they then decided that perhaps Captain Francis Crozier, who had actually captained the Terror on James Clark Ross's Antarctic expedition, should be the one to lead this expedition, as he had, more than 9 years of experience in the Arctic and Antarctic. But they finally decided that the honor of discovering the passage should go to an Englishman rather than an Irishman, so he was passed over. This is how the Admiralty came to their fourth choice, Sir John Franklin, the aging captain who hadn't held command of a ship in over a decade and had not been in the Arctic in nearly 2 decades. And he was essentially given the job by way of nepotism, from the vouching of his previous Arctic mates, many of whom had been knighted and belonged to exclusive dinner and social clubs favored by the high-ranking Admiralty. So while Franklin would be in charge of the overall expedition, the Admiralty elected to make Captain Crozier his second in command and the captain of the Terror, while James Fitzjames would be the third in overall command and would actually attend to the day-to-day running of the flagship Erebus. And so it was that 134 men waved goodbye to their family and other onlookers on May 19th, 1845. They set sail from Kent, traveling up the east coast of Britain, briefly stopping at Scotland's Orkney Islands for additional supplies, before then embarking on a 30-day journey to Disco Bay on the western side of Greenland for one last resupply, before departing into the wilderness of Canada's Arctic archipelago. It was there that the crew wrote their final letters home, and Franklin prophesied that it would be the last time anyone would hear from them for about 2 years. He told others that they would likely not hear an update before autumn of 1847 from either far eastern Kamchatka, maybe Japan, perhaps China. But, perhaps a bit ominously, the crew was reduced from 134 men to 129, as 5 were returned to England for being either too ill or otherwise unfit for the journey. In late July, the expedition crossed into Baffin Bay, where they were forced to wait for icy conditions to improve before finally entering into Lancaster Sound. While they waited, they conversed with whalers for a few days, and these whalers were the last Europeans to see them alive, and clues about what happened to the lost expedition would not come to light until the second wave of search parties were launched in 1850. So once again, I'm not going to recap the many searches for the expedition and the truth of their ultimate fate, but I do want to highlight some of the key findings that they made and examine what they suggest about what happened to the expedition. Here is what we know for certain. The expedition left a trail of evidence from Beechey Island to 700 kilometers south on King William Island. What the artifacts and Inuit testimony suggest is that the ships first attempted to follow their primary orders to go north towards the hypothetical open polar sea before turning south to the still unknown portion of Canada's northern coastline. From there, the ships became ice-locked for a couple of years before being abandoned for the crew's ill-fated march south, hoping to make it to a trading post still several hundred kilometers away. The actual specifics of what became of the crew requires a deal of interpretation and is still hotly debated amongst experts to this day. But with that said, let's dive into the biggest finds and what the leading authorities have to make of them. The first big discovery came in 1850 when 3 graves were discovered at Beechey Island, just north of Lancaster Sound. These bodies were identified as stoker John Torrington, able seaman John Hartnell, and Marine Private William Brain. The dates on their graves indicated that all these men had died between New Year's Day to early April of 1846. These bodies, which oddly enough were discovered by the brother of the Terror's assistant surgeon, along with trash and sledge marks, confirmed to the rescue party that the ships had wintered at Beechey from 1845 to 1846. And this was quite foreboding because as far as contemporary Arctic expeditions went, 3 deaths were the most ever suffered, and that was over the course of 4 years. Now here it was less than a year into the trip, and there were already 3 men dead with no cause of death left on the grave markers. This, along with the 5 men turned back at Greenland, has led some to believe that there was either some unknown sickness or something wrong with the food that they had taken along. Whatever the case, the bodies remained where they were for about 140 years until 1984, and then again in 1986, when an anthropologist named Owen Beatty went to Beachy to exhume the bodies and see what could be learned from the autopsy. The bodies were surprisingly well preserved in the ice, and Michael, I'm going to show you them here. Can you just describe these so-called ice mummies?
Right, and this is something that we had taken a look at before when we were doing our initial research into Ends of the Earth. These images, I will just warn you in advance, are very disturbing.
Oh, they're very disturbing.
You are welcome to search this out yourself, but you are seeing 150-year-old corpses, and be prepared for that. So I'll just describe it in a very general sense. You would think that after 150 years there'd be absolutely nothing left of these bodies. But because of just the brutal cold of the northern poles and all the areas surrounding them, you have hair, you have teeth, you have entire eyes, you have bodies that, to me, from my very limited understanding of the human decomposition process, of course, these people look like they might have died 3-4 weeks ago. It looks to me almost like I'm looking at a Hollywood special effect of what artists were told to create when they were asked to make dead bodies.
So like Michael said, the skin is still there, the hair is still there, quite a bit longer, obviously, but even the clothes are still intact, and it's just a very unnerving sight.
It reminds me about the bodies that you'll find when you climb Mount Everest. When you get into these situations to where you're in lands that are so cold that almost nothing can survive, bodies become mummified, they don't decompose. Which leads me to believe, and this is something we'll talk about a little later, that even now, in 2022 when we're recording this, there might still be evidence out there to get more conclusive information on this.
That's entirely possible. Discoveries have been found as recently as, I think, 2019, so who knows what's still out there. Either way, though, when Beatty exhumed these bodies, he took samples from their lungs, hair, and fingernails. And what he concluded is that all 3 of these men had died of pneumonia brought on by tuberculosis. However, what he also discovered was that all 3 of these men had very high levels of lead in their system. And before Beatty had exhumed these bodies, he had a hunch, because he had also examined the bones from the crew further south on King William Island, and after analyzing it, discovered that they also had traces of lead. This led Beatty and others to believe that the crew was driven to dire health early on from high lead concentrations in their diets. There are a number of factors that point towards the possibility of lead poisoning being a factor in the crew's demise, and the most notable of which is the canned food which they brought along. So from what we understand, the Admiralty put up a bid about 3 months before the ship set sail. And that bid was who could provide 8,000 cans of food the fastest and the cheapest. And the bid went to one Stefan Goldner, who just barely made the delivery. And this has led to Goldner's canning process being scrutinized quite a bit since the expedition's disappearance. First of all, canning food was at this point not done on an industrial scale. In those days, pretty much all the cans were being soldered by hand, and some used lead as their soldering. Fulfilling an order of 8,000 cans in less than 3 months would have been an immense undertaking, and it's been proposed that in their hurry, canners may have gotten sloppy with the lead soldering, allowing some of that to drip inside of the can and mix in with the food inside. And this has actually been backed up by the fact that a portion of the cans found at Beachy Island had noticeable globs of lead inside of the cans.
And you have to remember that this is fundamentally different than cans as you know them today. Our cans now in our pantries and our grocery stores are all pressed together. There is no soldering element. It's folded sheets of aluminum kind of pressed together in an airtight manner. What we're talking about here is quite literally soldering something on like you would imagine somebody soldering 2 pieces of metal together. So as you can imagine, the possibility of food contamination was quite high.
Yeah, and speaking of food contamination, that wasn't the only possible source of lead. You remember that modern piping I mentioned the ships had? Well, they were also made of lead. Now, listen, people have been using lead pipes for drinking waters for years. I mean, even here in the US, we're still having trouble with that. And while it's certainly a detriment to one's health, it doesn't normally prove fatal in the course of just a few years. However, there were some important factors to consider about these pipes. First off, lead is most easily absorbed into water which is freshly distilled, heated up, and the pipes are new with little to no layer of silt built up. The pipes on the Erebus and Terror checked all three of these boxes. This hot water could have contaminated the food when being used for cooking or reheating. So while lead might not have been a primary fatal factor, it could have hastened the men's demise by draining their health as well as causing them to act irrationally. And I just want to list a couple of symptoms of lead poisoning, which include joint and muscle pain, cognitive difficulties such as fatigue and mood disorders, as well as headaches and abdominal pain, none of which you want if you're in a survival situation, obviously. There's evidence of incredibly poor or confused decision-making, which we'll cover a little bit later. But for right now, I should note that the lead poisoning hypothesis is not universally accepted by Franklin experts. First off, there's no knowing whether or not the lead content in the bodies at Beachy are representative of the rest of the crew. Right? I mean, you don't have a control group to compare that to. But it should be noted that the traces of lead found in the bodies of Beachy were actually higher than those observed in the bones found on King William Island. Additionally, it should be noted that traces of lead were much more common in the 19th century, as a lot of piping was lead. So naturally, all the men going into the Arctic would have done so with concentrations of lead in their systems. Additionally, the men on the expedition would have first eaten the fresh food before relying on the canned food later on, so it wouldn't make much sense for them to get lead poisoning so early into the journey. And finally, the lead soldering in the cans was only observed in a small portion of the tins at Beachy, and if that's anything to go by, then the majority of the cans were probably soldered correctly.
It might be one of those situations in which it's kind of an all of the above. You might have had cans that resulted in lead poisoning that would have killed these three men that were found at Beachy Island. You might have a non-lethal but still very dangerous level of lead found in many other cans. It might be one of those situations to where lead poisoning took out a very large population on the ship, but it was not something to where it was the only issue with the expedition.
Well, Mike, that's a good gut check, because a lot of people who discuss this will tell you there's probably no smoking gun that wiped out the expedition. It was probably a combination of things, which plays into what I want to get into next, which is other food-related theories. Lead poisoning was not the only possible issue with the canned goods. Another allegation against Goldner has been that in his rush to fulfill the order, he did not properly heat the food, causing them to go bad before the cans were even opened. If this were the case, it could have produced an illness known as botulism. This comes from a toxin produced by bacteria and is known to be a risk amongst people who ferment or can their own goods. Symptoms of this disease are pretty nightmarish. The toxin first attacks the muscles, slowly paralyzing a person. And while that's happening, they'll be racked with violent nausea as the body tries to purge the toxin through vomiting and diarrhea. The paralysis causes the eyelids to droop, the throat and mouth to cease functioning, before finally paralyzing the lungs until they quit breathing. And I should also note that sensory deficits are uncommon, and the mental status of the person suffering usually remains clear, which means they're feeling every second of that. I mean, just imagine, you don't know why, because they didn't have a good understanding of germ theory back then, but all of a sudden, you're slowing down, you can't seem to make your body do things, and then little by little, you feel yourself shutting down, you can't use your limbs, you start to not even be able to use your mouth, your throat, you have trouble swallowing, your eyelids droop, and you just are in pain the entire time, again, throwing up, having diarrhea. You can't articulate to anybody what you feel, but they can see you having these silent screams until finally you just give out from it. That's possibly what some of these men were facing. However, it should be said that traces of botulism have never been observed in any of the cans or bodies, though I will note I don't know if that's scientifically possible to observe that at this point. But there is one piece of information that may suggest putrid food was possibly affecting the expedition. We'll discuss this a little later, but there was actually a note left behind from the expedition in 1848. And part of what that note mentions is that the total loss at life, 3 years into it, is 9 officers and 15 men. And so remember, when they set off, they had 24 officers and 129 men, so they were losing officers at a much higher rate than they were regular men. One suggestion for this has been that as the food supply gradually began to run out, officers would have been better fed than the common seamen, meaning that they would have been dipping into the cans more quickly than the rest of the crew, who were probably still eating salt pork and ship's biscuits day in and day out. And if something was wrong with the canned foods, it would have affected the officers first. And of course, anytime you're talking about food and the open sea back then, there's always every sailor's worst nightmare: scurvy. Scurvy, as I mentioned in the last episode, comes from the result of a vitamin C deficiency and always proved to be the bane of sailors due to being on long voyages without access to fresh food, fresh vegetables, fresh fruit. And so as your body is deprived of vitamin C, your body is unable to continue producing collagen, which is the connective tissue that essentially holds your body together. Gradually, your body will begin to break down with your gums swelling, your teeth falling out, your skin will begin to tear and bleed more easily, you'll become generally fatigued and disoriented, and as it progresses, you'll start bleeding from every orifice. You'll be unable to move, and you'll just die a bleeding mess. It's very clear to see why everybody was worried about this. But to counter this, the ships took along barrels of lemon juice that the sailors would have swallowed with a bit of sugar to cut down sourness. Lemon juice gradually loses its antiscorbutic properties over time, and by 3 years into the journey, it probably would have done so considerably. And so as you think about food with the Lost Expedition, you can imagine these men man-hauling huge amounts of material across a frozen ocean, building up a tremendous calorie deficit that they're just unable to get the nutrition required to meet. And you can imagine that nobody could survive in such conditions for very long, especially with the possible difficulties described here.
Like Graham's saying, to me it kind of comes down to a factor of if the shoe fits. If we know that these cans were contributing alongside the lead piping in the ship to hide traces of lead poisoning, specifically in the 3 bodies found at Beachy Island, it makes perfect sense to assume that botulism might have played into a factor, especially when you're looking at the officers dying at a much higher rate. And as we're talking about with calorie deficits, a lot of scientists have taken a look at those 3 mummified bodies, and scientific research suggests that John Torrington specifically weighed about 38.5 kilos at his death. And for those of us who use imperial, that's 84 pounds. At a certain rate, it shouldn't matter how tall he was. No adult man should be weighing 84 pounds.
Absolutely not. The next big discoveries didn't happen until about 7 years after this, when Lady Jane scraped together enough money to send out another expedition. She was at this point resigned to the fact that her husband had died out there, but she wanted to know the truth because she didn't buy into the fact that, they resorted to cannibalism in their last days. So she sent out one Leopold McClintock, who was regarded as the father of Arctic sledging, to go to King William Island to discover the true fate of what became the expedition. As you can imagine, due to ice conditions, McClintock wasn't able to actually sail to King William Island, but he did what he did best, which was to get into harness and to sledge his way down there. As he went along, he encountered Inuit who told the same story that they had told to previous explorers, that there was a camp of dead white men, what they called kabluna, on the south side of King William Island, and that there was a trail of them laying face down as though they had died as they walked. Once McClintock reached the south side of King William Island, he found one such body and a journal. A journal which has come to be known as the Pegler Papers, as they seem to contain the writings of Terror's captain of the foretop, Harry Pegler, though strangely, the body doesn't seem to be his at all. The body bearing this journal was slight and wearing the uniform of a ship's steward, while Pegler was known to be a strong man. It's been proposed this might have been the body of gunroom steward Thomas Armitage, a man that Pegler had sailed with before. And perhaps Pegler had entrusted this journal to him before he died, hoping that he may send it and other personal effects back to his family. Now, we know this today, but it actually took years to uncover the truth of the Pegler papers, because when they looked inside, they originally believed it was written in German. And after realizing that it wasn't German, they thought it could be some maybe Eastern European language, before finally, after a good deal of analysis, they realized that the words written within were written backward, with the last letters of each word capitalized as those the first. So one can only speculate as to why Pegler did this. One theory I saw proposed was that he did it to throw off his shipmates from trying to read it, because presumably they would have been semi-literate and, like all these people trying to examine it, wouldn't have been able to make heads or tails of it. But whatever the case, translating the journal does not provide a clear glimpse into the crew's final months. The journal has been exposed to the elements for at least a decade at that point, so it was obviously quite water damaged. And the legible parts only provide strange snatches of lyrics, unknown locales, and musings that probably only made sense to the men on the journey. There is, for instance, a drawing on one page that resembles a closed eye with the words Lid Bay, suggesting perhaps they encountered a bay that they named Lid Bay. And there's also reference to a place called Terror Camp. Maybe it was the name of the camp that the men of the Terror camped at after abandoning the ship. Now, to give you an idea of how much information and context is listing, Michael, I'd like you to read the following passage.
All right, I'll take my best crack at this. It seems like it's going to be a bit of a struggle. O death, where are is thy string? The grave at Comfort Cove. For who has any duot, how Nelson look? The dryer was, and there Trafalgar as. Of him and, to, friends A, Latour Cours, Best and Adam and Eve another death. Right hand's new grave, I ham too, will be a Versailles, signed, me yes, and a splendid, and that aches trade flourish. Now...
Yeah, so what do you think that means, Michael?
To be quite honest, I was confused as to why you had said that this had been something that was assumed to be a foreign language, because I was picturing modern text. Of course, I'm kind of I'm beholden to my own time period. I was imagining if you're capitalizing the end of a word instead of the beginning, how could that be difficult to read? But I could definitely understand how something like this scrawled into a waterlogged journal would be very difficult to understand.
Yeah, because even reading it as you did, and for those listening, Mike was trying to pronounce words that were certainly misspelled. It's confusing even when you can read it. Experts have come up with different interpretations, and one I've read, which seems to make the most sense to everybody, is that it was perhaps a eulogy to Captain Franklin, as there is reference to scripture, O death, where is thy sting? There's the mention of a grave, and it should also be noted that Franklin was the only member of the expedition who was at the Battle of Trafalgar, and we get that mention of Nelson and Trafalgar, so perhaps the person writing this was noting his courage in that and, holding him in reference. There's also this passage, which I'll try to read for you. We will have his new boots in the middle watch, as we have got some very hard ground to heave, shall want some grog to wet our whistle. All my art, Tom, for I don't think for our now clothes should lay and first men 21st night agreed. So what do you think that means, Michael?
From what I'm seeing, I have no idea. Some reference to wetting a whistle, getting food. We have mentions of wanting new clothes, new boots.
Mm-hmm.
It just reads to me like people longing for the lives they had when they were not out here in this great barren land.
Yeah, they found this body just far out in the wilderness away from the ships. I mean, one could only imagine being in such merciless conditions, wanting the things that they had previously. But just to give a little context to that, from the best that Franklin experts can make out, they think that it could be referencing something that McClintock later found, he found a stack of boots 4 feet high further north on the island. And that reference there to 21st night agreed could be a reference to when they left the ships. There's a message that we'll get to in a little bit, but it was pinned on the 25th, and it's been proposed perhaps that they left 4 days before that, but more on that in a moment. To wrap things up with the Pegler papers, the writings also appear to show that Pegler is confused. There are passages that read like this. Whose is this coffee? And another section, which appears to be describing a big man saying in part, was a marine by the cut of his big, which was kind of strange because you would think that after 3 years with, again, 124 men in total, most everybody would have been at least familiar with each other and their names by that point. So this is pure speculation, but it's read by some as evidence for the prolonged lead poisoning leading to confusion amongst the survivors. Whatever the case, the next big find by McClintock is the one which gives us the most evidence for what happened to the crew. This comes in the form of a message found about midway up the island. They found a stack of stones, which are, I believe, referred to as cairns, and within this cairn was a brass cylinder bearing a message. Now, a brief word about these brass cylinders. Ships that were sent to the Arctic would have had lots of brass cylinders with pre-written messages, where someone could have left their latitude and longitude, a brief little message, followed by 6 sentences written in 6 different languages, saying to the effect, "If found, please return to the Admiralty. We'll give you an award." What's kind of peculiar about this expedition is that only one was ever found, this one, when they should have been leaving them at every stop they went to. And that's just what's so frustrating about the mystery of what happened to Franklin's expedition, is we just have a general lack of information that should have otherwise been there. Either way, when the crew found it, they opened it up and this message was printed on it. HMS ships Erebus and Terror wintered in the ice in latitude 70 degrees 5 minutes north, longitude 98 degrees 23 minutes west. Having wintered in 1846-7 at Beechey Island in latitude 74 degrees 43 minutes 28 seconds north, longitude 91 degrees 39 minutes 15 seconds west. After having ascended the Wellington Channel to latitude 77 degrees and returned by the west side of Cornwallis Island, Sir John Franklin commanding the expedition. All well. Party consisting of 2 officers and 6 men left the ships on Monday 24th May 1847. Signed Lieutenant Graham Gore and mate Charles Frederick DeVoe. So these coordinates would have put the ship on the west side of King William Island with no protection against the oncoming ice. And this message, in addition to that, is strange for 2 reasons, and the first one being that there is no mention of the dead crewmen at Beechey Island. Now, maybe they had left a previous message before that would have explained this, but still, they leave off with that all well. And the second is that it obviously gets the wintering at Beechey off by a year. The graves and the other evidence suggests that they wintered from 1845 to 46 and not 46 to 47. All that's strange, but it gets much more ominous and perplexing because scrawled around the margins of the first message from the top of the paper, literally all the way around it, is a second message, which reads thus. 1848. HM ships Terror and Erebus were deserted on the 22nd of April, 5 leagues north-northwest of this, having been beset since 12th of September 1846. The officers and crews consisting of 105 souls under the command of Captain F.R.M. Crozier landed here in latitude 69 degrees 37 minutes 42 seconds north, longitude 98 degrees 41 minutes west. This paper was found by Lieutenant Irving under the cairn supposed to have been built by Sir James Ross in 1831, 4 miles to the northward, where it had been deposited by the late Commander Gore in, the word May is crossed out, June 1847. Sir James Ross's pillar has not, however, been found, and the paper has been transferred to this position, which is that in which Sir J. Ross's pillar was erected. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847, and the total loss by deaths in the expedition to this date has been 9 officers and 15 men. Signed, James Fitzjames, Captain HMS Erebus. Signed, F.R.M. Crozier, Captain and Senior Officer. And just under that's written, and start on tomorrow, 26, for Back's Fish River. So what we have here is the new expedition leaders telling us that their commander died a little more than 2 weeks after stating all was well, and that a further 8 officers and 12 men had died since Beachy, and frustratingly, with no indication of how. I'll say also, the meandering talk about looking for the original cairn that was supposed to have located the original message, and the search for that is also a bit confusing, perhaps suggesting some sort of delirium. And finally, rather than sledge east towards the beginning of the archipelago, they instead decided to turn south, presumably as was written towards Great Fish River, which, sailing up it, would have still been hundreds of kilometers to the nearest trading outpost.
What's kind of ominous about looking visually at the Victory Point note is just the sight of that initial message, that all well, literally kind of being surrounded and consumed by the scrawling on the other sides of it. I'll try to remember to post something on social media about it specifically so you can kind of get a look at it for yourself, but I would highly encourage you to seek that out for yourself. I know Wikipedia has a really good, high-quality photo scan of this document, but this is definitely the thing that we have the most information of when it comes to the Lost Expedition, and it really just kind of summates the entire experience, where you have somebody having that initial statement in the middle and just everything going wrong, and having to go back, find this message, yank it out, and scrawl in this new information all around the side of it in order to convey what actually happened.
Yeah, in the face of a lack of archaeological evidence, it's certainly gives us the clearest picture, but certainly a horrifying picture as well, and you'll just have to see it to know what we mean. But that does bring me to the last major find by McClintock on this 1857 expedition, which was the finding of a lifeboat. As the party turned north up the western side of the island, they came across a lifeboat that was 28 feet long and 7 feet wide, mounted to a sledge. Strangely, though, the boat was facing north, back in the direction of the ships, rather than south. Inside the boat was 2 skeletons, both of which were missing their skulls. And what was found inside the boat was rather puzzling to the men who discovered it. Inside, the father of Arctic sledging was perplexed at what they chose to bring along, which included a variety of devotional books, as well as secular books like The Vicar of Wakefield. He also described seeing a large quantity of clothing, towels, sponges, soap, toothbrushes, hair combs, more practical items like powder, bullets, shot cartridges, needle and thread, sailmaker's palms, but again, perplexing things such as 40 pounds of chocolate and some tea. Things that really would not have been at all helpful to anybody in the wilderness of the Arctic. This has again been cited by some as signs of confusion from lead poisoning, but I mean, to be honest with you, I'm not sure it's so easy to chalk up to that. The Inuit were discovered with fine silverware in China. So these men were taking valuables, and I mean, me personally, I think perhaps they were just trying to have something of worth by the time they made it back to civilization.
It's interesting to think about because you would suspect that these men had already gone through these bouts of botulism. They had seen several men die at this point from various illnesses, likely attributed to lead poisoning, but at this point they still had the hope of making it back and knowing that they would need something to barter with in order to return back to England.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they had probably brought some of these trinkets along just as trade items. I remember again in the Coppermine expedition, one issue they had was they brought all these trinkets, but they didn't encounter anybody to trade with them, so they wound up shedding them. But these 2 souls on the boat evidently held on to them until the very end. In addition to these things, the McClintock expedition found that stack of boots I mentioned earlier, with nails driven through the soles like cleats, stacks of clothing, they found camp stoves, tools like pickaxes, shovels, and then again, things that didn't really seem to make sense, like iron rod curtains. But this, in addition to the note left behind, led them to believe that the crew had traveled down the west side of the island until they reached the southern end before perhaps crossing over to the Adelaide Peninsula. In addition to the artifacts, we do, of course, have Inuit testimony to what became of the expedition. The first of which came in 1854 from John Ray's expedition to still what was believed to be King William Land, but as he discovered was, of course, King William Island. The Inuit he encountered undoubtedly had contact with the expedition, as they had a number of artifacts that could have only come from there, including silverware, etched with FRM Crozier, as well as officers' caps and a bronze medal Franklin had been awarded for his service in Greece. The Inuit that Ray encountered said that about 4 or 5 summers back, so that might have been 1848, it might have been 1849, they had seen a group of 40 to 50 white people, again they call kabluna. They said that these kabluna were dragging sledges south on King William Island, and by signs, kind of a rudimentary sign language, they said that they had ships which were crushed in the ice, but they were still going south. These Inuit left them, but the following spring found them dead, with 5 more bodies further south on an island near the shore. I had this quote in the last episode, but I think it bears stating again. Ray summed up his report like this. Some bodies were in a tent, or tents. Others were under the boat, which had been turned over to form a shelter, and some lay scattered about in different directions. Of those seen on the island, it was supposed that one was an officer, a chief, as he had a telescope strapped over his shoulders, and his double-barrel gun lay underneath him. From the mutilated state of many bodies and kettles, it is evident that our wretched countrymen had been driven to the last dread alternative as a means of sustaining life. A few of the unfortunate men must have survived until the arrival of wild fowl, say until the end of May, as shots were heard and fresh bones and feathers of geese were noticed near the scene of this sad event. And as I mentioned in the previous episode, Ray was widely criticized for failing to actually investigate the site himself, as well as his suggestions of cannibalism being dismissed even by the likes of Charles Dickens. However, more information was uncovered by Leopold McClintock when he encountered the Inuit whilst traveling south towards the island. Some of those that he met, like I said, bore china with the Franklin family crest and other artifacts that they claimed to have gotten from a 3-masted ship. The Inuit told him that to the west of King William Island, a ship had been crushed by the ice, but its crew had exited safely. However, there was another ship that wasn't crushed, and a party of Inuit went aboard to investigate. They said that those went aboard encountered the body of a large man with long teeth. They took some of the artifacts that they still had, but when they later returned, the ship was gone, presumably crushed by the ice. They likewise mentioned the trail of bodies leading south, unburied and appearing to have died where they'd fallen, suggesting perhaps the crews were too weak to go back and bury their fellow seamen. This has led some to believe that the lack of archaeological evidence comes from the fact that these men died trekking over a frozen sea, and, when the ocean would have thawed, they would have sunk to the bottom.
I've always found it interesting that whenever we're having these discussions, and of course for myself and Graham, this research into polar exploration has been something of a process over these past few months, that the English in general find the idea of cannibalism so repugnant that they are unwilling to listen to that information. They find it to be something completely incongruent to something that an Englishman would do. And when you're thinking about these barren landscapes and the amount of suffering and death that would have been surrounding these men, it's not that hard to imagine. So it's interesting that they must reject this. And it reminds me of the earlier episode we had when we were discussing the superiority of the English race. That was something that we had talked about almost in jest, because it seemed like something that was so beyond the pale, something that made very little sense in comparison to how we understand the world today. And to me, that accusation of cannibalism being so repugnant kind of ties into that greater idea of the superiority of the English race. Whereas it's much easier to denounce these things when you're sitting on what is essentially one of the most modern, innovative places on Earth at the time, and not wandering through the barren landscape trying to survive.
Yeah, this cuts to the core of what we were talking to Paul Van Peenan about earlier, which was the fact that these northern people live on these very high-calorie diets. A lot of what they eat is fat and lard and meat just from the animals. Again, there's very little plant life up there. And they had to have these high-calorie diets because of all the work it takes to move across a landscape that is ultimately hostile to human life. And so when you think about these people from a totally different culture that totally looked down on the way that these northern peoples live, you see a disconnect because they don't understand what it is to live there. And of course, these explorers who did go there, who did meet with a disaster, finally at the very end did understand why they lived the way they did. But of course, without any way of communicating that to the people back home, it remains alien and unthinkable. In addition to McClintock's expedition, the Inuit in the area continued to tell the same basic story, and I'd like to tell you about two more men who gathered stories from them. The first being that of Charles Francis Hall, a Cincinnati businessman who left his family to go live in the Arctic with the Inuit. After one expedition to Frobisher Bay, he came to believe the oral history of the Inuit was solid because those Inuit that he met with told him a story of encountering explorers on a three-masted ship, which could have only been that of the Frobisher expedition 300 years before. Going off of the Inuit testimony told to McClintock, he made his way to King William Island in 1869, and the Inuit that he met there described seeing the same three-masted ship to the west of the island. They further gave more grisly details about the last months of the men's lives. They said that they saw bones that had been sawed and skulls with holes in them, and there were also signs that animals had gnawed on them. They further told Hall that they had been to the site of that camp, and that there were many books and papers around it. Not understanding the significance, they let their children play with them, and so for many years afterwards, they reported seeing papers blowing around in the wind until finally they had disappeared. They told him of parleying with a man who seemed to fit Captain Crozier's description, and with him they traded some food. And apparently, Crozier begged them to stay, but they left out of fear that they would overpower them and steal all that they had. They also told Hall some things that he didn't believe, including that the man who matched Crozier's description and a couple of other men were kept alive, that they fed them, and that one spring, a couple of years later, they had left them with a kayak to row east towards the mainland. Whatever the case, Hall wound up finding a skeleton with a gold tooth, which they successfully identified as Lieutenant H.T.D. Levequant, and his remains were later shipped back to England to be interred by his family. Finally, there was an expedition undertaken by an American Army lieutenant named Schwatka, who went there in the late 1870s. The Inuit he encountered in the area also described the same three-masted ship to the west of the island, and that it actually sank as a result of them cutting their way into it and seawater entering into the ship once the thaw came. They also took him to a place on the Adelaide Peninsula just south of King William Island, to where they claimed the expedition had come to an end. Schwatka called this place Starvation Cove, and the Inuit told him that they had happened upon a boat of dead white men, one of which still had brown hair and gold spectacles on his face. In the boat, there were books and a tin box filled with bones. They claimed that these bones looked fresh, and they had supposed that whoever was on board had been eating them. There was also apparently a small and large saw, and they also recited the story of the papers fluttering around the south side of King William Island. For a long time, the Inuit stories were met with skepticism because where they mentioned seeing the ships did not line up with the coordinates on the Victory Point note. However, in 2014 and then in 2016, they found vindications when the wreck sites of the Erebus and Terror were finally found. Today you can actually go and visit these places. I found one website which offers a 17-day journey offered by Quark Polar Expeditions, where for 15,000 American dollars, you can sail the expedition's route to Beachy and explore the historic sites by Zodiac boat and helicopter. Additionally, I've read that some of the descendants of the Inuit encountered around King William Island still reside there and run a motel where you can visit, take tours, and listen to tales long passed down.
It's the idea that this route, which no doubt caused the death of over 100 men, is just something that you can just go take a tourist destination to. Just kind of reminds me of the same gaudy sort of dark interest that we have in these sorts of events. I kind of think about the people that have explored the wreckage of the Titanic or been interested in that sort of thing. It's also interesting for me to think about the fidelity of the Inuit passed down testimony as truth. I know that we have seen some sort of incongruity with these reports, but based on the oral traditions and histories of these cultures, it makes a lot more sense to believe these on a general sense. So, from my understanding of this situation, and from where we have found the Terror and the Erebus itself, it's hard not to believe what they say when they report these things. Maybe not the sequence specifically or in the understanding of the specifics of the dates, but it seems highly likely to me that all of these things did happen.
So that was some of the bigger discoveries found in search of the expedition. There's a large number of other things that were found, as well as Inuit tales that we just didn't have time to go into, but I thought that this has been a somewhat satisfying dive into the mystery of the expedition. I'll just throw it out there. If there was any other information or stories you would like to have heard discussed, please throw it out to us on either our website or social media.
I think for the purposes of this discussion, I think we've gone about as deep as we possibly could have. I'm not sure of the runtime of this one, but this one feels a bit longer than our usual fare. I will say that what's interesting about exploring these topics, and specifically the ones that don't have a completed historical record to them, is that there's so much room for interpretation and understanding of the events. We have the basics of it. We understand that from what we understand, there were absolutely no survivors to this event. But the specifics behind it, whether or not they were convinced that they could make this journey down the river to find civilization, or if they had committed to it only to find that they had turned back at a far too late hour, it's interesting to think about what could have been. Something that I was talking about with Graham earlier was that a lot of the difficulty of traversing the Northwest Passage is the specific section. These several dozen islands within the Canadian Arctic Archipelago. Once you get out to the Beaufort Sea and you get out towards Alaska, this journey becomes far easier for various geological reasons. And these days, with the way climate change is coming and the way tidal shifts have changed, the way the polar ice caps are these days, it's entirely possible that within our lifetimes, this Northwest Passage will just be just another trade route, much like the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, just various routes that you can sail to. So it's interesting to take a look at this time in a history when this route would have been most beneficial for these people, and that it was worth risking everything in order to sail through here. Now that we're kind of putting a capstone on the end of our discussion of the Northwest Passage specifically and the Canadian Archipelago, we're going to continue on with Ends of the Earth with discussions more so on the North and South Poles. But now that we're moving on beyond this, I find it interesting that we're taking a look into a very specific time in history, the only time in history, if things continue as they are, where the Northwest Passage was untraversable.
As much bad planning went into the expedition, it's worth noting that examining deep ice cores, it's been found that the years that a lot of British expeditions were launched towards the Northwest Passage happened to be the coldest years on record for that region. And it was just a strange quirk of fate that the Franklin expedition was even able to go south towards that unknown Canadian coastline, because southward flowing ice normally chokes up any of those channels, but they just happened to catch it on a year that they could sail in. But then, of course, for the next 2 years, the sea never unfroze, and they just remained stuck. So it's as much of bad timing as it was bad planning for this expedition.
It's an interesting foray into something that would have not happened in this way almost any other year, going off of what you had said. If it was frozen earlier, would they have had the time to turn back and successfully return to England without further catastrophe? If it had melted and unfrozen later, in the year or two later, could they have been able to go on forward or turn back and not had their ships frozen for so long that they must have been abandoned?
It is unfortunate, but I mean, trying as hard as they did, conditions wouldn't become right for traversing the passage for another 50 or 60 years when Roald Amundsen did it in 1903. And of course, today we have the occasional ice cutter making its way through the passage, but like Michael said, it's probably going to become a reality within our lifetimes. But with wrapping up the story of Franklin's lost expedition, you really do see the end of British exploration being a utilitarian approach to the poles, and turning instead towards what is seen as a heroic age of Arctic and Antarctic exploration, when the men who set out to find the poles were doing so for the pride of their nation and were seen in terms of doing combat with nature and the elements themselves.
I think having done this research on some level with Graham, laying out the groundwork for the story that we're telling with Ends of the Earth, leaving Franklin behind is kind of the last time you could see an understanding and have an empathy for what these people were trying to accomplish. From this point on, you really start seeing the vanity and, in some ways, the audacity of what these people are trying to accomplish from this point on. We are no longer trying to develop something for our countries. we're just trying to get glory by any means possible.
Yeah, I don't want to downplay the struggle that these men had in their explorations, but the intentions behind them certainly become a lot more naked.
So that's all that we've got for you today. But before we go, we have a special announcement, something that we've been working on for a really long time. Launching today is the Grisly History Patreon support page. For any dollar amount you choose, starting at $3 a month, you'll gain access to our Patreon-only feed. And on there, you'll be able to take a look behind the scenes, access exclusive Patreon-only podcasts, listen to uncut interviews, and much more. Your support helps us offset the time and cost of producing Grisly History, and also enables us to invest in better equipment and editing tools to improve the show. As a special thank you for your early support, our first 10 patrons will be mailed the die-cut matte sticker of the Grisly History Bear as pictured on our social media accounts. We continue to appreciate the love and support you've given the show, whether you choose to subscribe to our Patreon page or not. Even just telling a friend or tuning in each episode means the world to us, and we can't thank you enough. For more information, head to our social media accounts or our website, grislyhistory.com, and if you'd like to head directly to the Patreon account, that's patreon.com/grislyhistory.
As much as we appreciate the support, we also just want to take that opportunity to just interact with you as the audience. Again, one big reason why Michael and I are doing the show is we want to have that dialogue, that kind of conversation about the stories that we're discussing. So please jump in, comment, reach out to us, and let's have that conversation. But as always, Grisly History is a history podcast hosted by myself, Graham Parker, and produced by Michael Ruiz. For more information about the show, as well as links to our various platforms, please visit our website, grislyhistory.com. Finally, if you have any commercial or narration work that requires voiceover talent, I am available and I'd love to get in touch with you. Please feel free to reach out to my email address, graham@grislyhistory.com, and I'd be happy to talk with you about your upcoming project. Again, that is graham@grislyhistory.com. That's all from us. Until next time, I'm Graham Parker.
I'm Michael Ruiz.
And we'll see you next time.